And joining us at the roundtable now is former Congressman Bill Owens, who is now with law firms in Plattsburgh and Washington, D.C., working on several cross-border issues. Colin Reed is a professor with the Department of Economics and Finance at SUNY Plattsburgh, a Clinton County legislator and a business owner. And it's good to have our friend Jay Bryan back with us. He is a retired business columnist with the Montreal Gazette. Welcome to you all. Nice to have you here. June starts out with a big week of economic reports coming out this week, and we are taping midweek, so we're not going to get the really big one on Friday, the employment numbers. But what are we seeing in the early part of the week? Are we getting a mixed bag here? We're seeing that factory orders are down, but construction is up, manufacturing up a tick.
I think it is a mixed bag. I think we'll probably find out later on in the week that indeed the employment numbers are relatively strong, but factory orders, manufacturing, they've been fluctuating. The GDP for the last quarter actually was revised downward into negative territory, but it's not all that surprising to economists. Matter of fact, economists thought the GDP figures would be slightly worse than they actually came in. So there's really no cause for alarm on some of the negatives, and some of the positives continue to trend upward.
It's a funny thing about American GDP numbers now for the past number of years. The first quarter has been disappointing, and of course, since this period is the period of recovery since the Great Recession, it's been, stimulating tremendous agonizing. The first quarter of every year it seems that people think, oh my God, the recovery's fallen apart. But there's some quirk in the figures. There are seasonal patterns in the figures that they try to wash out using statistical techniques, and they haven't been successful in doing that. So I think the balance of opinion among economic forecasters is very much what Colin's saying, that all of the numbers don't look good. Some of the numbers look good. Auto sales were quite good in the month of May. But that the trend does look as if it is strengthening. They're not wildly optimistic, but it does look as if the economy is continuing to strengthen, wouldn't you say?
I agree, and the economists are asking Commerce to come up with a slightly different formula for seasonal adjustment, because, as you said, for the last number of years, we've been having the same problem.
Hopefully an accurate one.
I think there's a caveat here, though. With China in a position where its economy is weakening, its growth is slowing, they are dumping goods onto the markets. This is not a currency manipulation situation. This is simply overproduction on their part, and they are now putting goods out into the rest of the world, which is decreasing pricing in many countries, including the United States. So that could have some, I think, short-term negative impacts on the economy as we roll forward over the next couple of months.
And we saw that in the trade figures. They were worsened because imports were up and exports weren't quite as competitive, not only for the China effect, but also the strong American dollar, for lack of other other currencies that are strong.
A secondary risk from China, of course, is that the stock market's widely seen as being in or pretty close to bubble territory, and that would have an impact on world markets and possibly on world economic growth if there were a serious decline.
We mentioned we're expecting to hear the employment numbers by the end of the week. A lot of speculation that as many as 200 to 220,000 new jobs may be created. If that's the case, and unemployment either holds at 5.4% or maybe even goes down a tick to 5.3%, does that put off the Fed's decision on whether to raise interest rates? Is the consensus now that we're looking at maybe September anyway?
I'm a big fan of Janet Yellen, actually. She's quite careful about raising interest rates prematurely. There's nothing you would want to do to stall this recovery, and I think she believes in that more firmly than past Fed chiefs. If anything, I think she had her druthers would be delayed even beyond September, but the market is already clearly factoring in interest rate increases in the near future.
We hear from Janet Yellen, and then the number two, Stanley Fischer. We keep hearing from him time to time, and he seems to have a more gloomy prediction. I think just this week again, warning companies don't be unprepared for another financial crisis, I think is what he said. We talked about auto sales ticking up in a really strong Memorial Day weekend, and May is traditionally when you get a lot of people going out. They'll take the tax refund check and look to go out and buy a car. A number of plants are canceling their summer shutdowns because sales are strong right now. Interesting, and closer to home, there is a social media campaign. This is from our friends at North Country Public Radio reporting on this. A social media campaign in Messina, New York, they are actively trying to entice Elon Musk and Tesla to look at Massena as a possible site for the construction of a factory. There's no indication that they're looking to expand and build another factory in other parts of the country that we know of beyond their plan in California, but obviously they see the old GM plant there, and they would love to see, they're getting, the cleanup is to the point where they're looking for tenants to come in, and they're actively trying to interest them.
It's certainly a very interesting approach to go the social media route. They've also engaged Senator Griffo and Congresswoman Stefanik in this process. I've had some communications with several of the people involved in that over in Massena. And one of the things that I think that they understand is that even if this isn't successful, what they've done is they've put the message out about the workforce that they have low-cost power, they have lots of land, and they have land at the GM site, which I think now is usable again. They have access to the St. Lawrence Seaway. So they're trying to, if you will, line up the elements for economic growth and to entice people. And part of the way you have to do that is you need to get the word out. And I think this is very clever, makes a lot of sense, and lays out what their, really what their community has to offer.
And as you mentioned, cheap hydropower right there. If those cars used aluminum, of course Alcoa is right there, and they're also pointing that out as well. No word from Tesla or from Elon Musk whether this has had any impact and whether they're considering any sort of an expansion. Of course, he's in everything from making electric cars to solar panels, to home batteries, to rockets. And in Vermont, he's teaming up with Green Mountain Power, these home batteries, working with them to try to market those.
And when you have somebody who's an entrepreneur like he is, I think that when you throw ideas out and you offer opportunities, this is the kind of guy who 6 months, a year, 3 years from now may come back and say, you know what, I have another idea that I'd like to explore in your area. So I think this is very smart, but I also think, again, you get it out there, you get it in the media, and you are telling the rest of the world what you have to offer as well.
I'm not sure if Massena knows, but he's also got a local connection. He did his engineering work at Queen's University, just basically a hop, skip, and jump away from Massena.
He has come under fire this week. He's been criticized. The LA Times took him to task for his company getting about $5 billion in government subsidies over the years. He shot back in the past couple of days saying that what company really hasn't received government subsidies?
He receives a fraction of the government subsidies that go to the rocket companies that are in competition with him. Much higher cost to deliver cargo and soon to deliver astronauts. First private company to ever put astronauts into orbit.
Yeah, I'm death on government subsidies to private industry, but if anybody in the country can make a case that he's taken government subsidies and used them to create a new technology that is commercially successful and is actually changing an industry in a really important way, I think it's Elon Musk. I mean, I never believed that a guy would be able to sell electric cars as successfully as he does. And he's not trying to sell electric cars at a modest price. People are paying a really premium price. I see them on the road in Montreal. You see them all over the place when you visit California. And the sales figures just look better and better. So I don't know if his government subsidies were fully justified or not, but when I think of the subsidies that go to industries like sugarcane production, for example, where it's not exactly a crucial, new economy business. You could buy it cheaper from offshore, but that would upset some powerful local political interests. Then maybe I'm not so indignant about Elon Musk.
Well, I think you also have to look at what constitutes a subsidy, right?
Yes.
I mean, there are outright grants, certainly. There's low interest loans, but there's also tax policy. And tax policy is probably the biggest driver of, if you will, government subsidies that we have in the United States. We're talking somewhere north of $1 trillion a year is given in the way of tax credits, deductions, et cetera. And we have not revamped that policy to take into account new technologies, new industries. And I think that when you're talking about the government subsidy issue, and you look at the fossil fuel industry, in particular,
Yeah.
you find it very heavily embedded and invested in government subsidies.
Yeah, every country pours hundreds of millions or billions of dollars down the drain in old subsidies, in barnacle-encrusted industries that everybody has pretty much forgotten about, but there's the subsidy, it's still there, it's cooked into the tax code, and it takes you can't get it out with a crowbar, and it doesn't do anything to spark the emergence of very valuable new industries.
Absolutely correct, and I don't know how you get that crowbar in place.
Yeah.
As we've seen, we've had talk of tax reform the last several years, completely unsuccessful.
Jay, the last time you were here, we were talking about Bombardier and the C-Series and finally trying to get that up and running, and they finally had some test flights early this year, back in the spring, but suddenly now within the past few weeks we've heard of widespread layoffs. About 1,700, 1,800 altogether, about 1,000 in the Montreal area.
That's right.
This is the business class jet that just isn't selling?
I think it's a combination of problems with the C-Series and some business jets and the turboprop airliners that they build in Toronto. And the 1,750 layoffs that were announced just in the past month are on top of something like 4,000 plus layoffs over the last year or so. Bombardier is obviously feeling a lot of pressure from a global economy that's really not going anywhere. So you don't have a whole lot of newly minted oligarchs who have to go out and must have a bigger, fancier jet than the guy down the street. And at the same time, I guess there's not as much demand for commercial aircraft, of which they build quite a lot. They build a lot of regional jets and stuff. And the C-Series, which, to be fair to Bombardier, is not at all unusual in the history of airliners, just delay after delay after delay, which, problems with the Dreamliner kept bursting into flame, problems with the giant Airbus bus aircraft that they could never seem to get assembled properly for a long time. So perhaps they'll get through this without too much permanent damage, but it's really, really tough to have to try and get a multi-billion-dollar new project going at the same time as the industry in general is not really very brisk.
And I think, we had the shakeup in Bombardier earlier this year when they replaced the CEO. And I think that was probably an indicator that these kinds of activities would be coming down the pike.
Yes.
And they clearly need to get, it sounds like, costs under control and move in an effective direction. Fortunately, I think the railcar industry continues to be pretty stable. There's more interest, I think, in passenger rail in the United States, particularly in the big cities, that continues to fuel the purchase of vehicles. And I hope that we will be able to sustain our operations here in Plattsburgh.
Yeah, company spokeswoman, we checked with her when this was announced, Marianne Roberts, saying that this should have no impact whatsoever on the rail division, that they're still moving right along. That's some bad news for Bombardier. It's sort of the tip of the iceberg. On the whole,
it is.
kind of
Bombardier is far from the only Canadian manufacturing company or major corporation that is experiencing problems. Right at the other end of the spectrum, from sort of fairly high tech at Bombardier, you can go to the resource companies, which dig stuff out of the ground and sell it. And Teck, a coal company, that's about as old industry as you can get. Rolling layoffs through this summer. The oil industry experiencing obviously serious pressures because the price of oil is down to half or whatever it was a year ago. And they had wildfires in the area of Alberta where they essentially dig up this tar sand that they convert into oil. And when you have wildfires going, you can't be producing. So yeah, a very, very bad series of blows to the economy. The only good news, I guess, is that oil, the price of oil is probably the single biggest influence on the value of the Canadian dollar. And while Canadian tourists in the United States might not like it very much, a low Canadian dollar does give a shot in the arm to Canadian exports, and it has been somewhat helpful in cushioning this. But basically, it's just been a rotten first half of the year for the Canadian economy. We had a shrinking economy in the first quarter, just as the United States did. But unlike the United States, we don't really have a lot of reason to believe that there'll be a significant upturn coming out of that until the US upturn, keep our fingers crossed, takes a hold. When a U.S. upturn takes hold, then it doesn't take very many months before Canada follows, because of course the United States is such an important customer and influence on the Canadian economy.
Oil prices have been going up, some rebounding, some
little. Yeah.
certainly gas prices have gone up as a result. Some speculation that maybe will it top out at about $70 a barrel later in the summer or this fall?
I think it could go even a little bit higher than that. But I think we are now seeing a realization in Canada of this Dutch disease, where if you rely too much on a really strong resource sector, usually devote less attention than necessary, don't renew that national industrial plan for the manufacturing sector. So this shot across the bow with low oil prices might actually benefit the Canadian economy in the long run.
The Keystone XL project is probably not moving at all until, or at least for a few years, or a new administration.
It certainly looks that way. It seems difficult for me to understand why the president has not made a decision one way or the other. I would have predicted 2 years ago that he would have accepted Keystone. I think now that's very unlikely, but I still think he should be acting. I've developed relationships with a number of the diplomats from Canada, Gary Doer, who's the ambassador, and John Prado, who's the CG in New York City. And for them, there's certainly the economic aspects of this, but it is also just the sense of, we're friends of yours, treat us that way. Make a decision. We may not like it, but we'll get beyond it, but we do need you to make a decision. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a real failing on the part of the administration in this particular arena. It's a little bit like the country of origin labeling issue. We've had 3 losses in the WTO, and we're still not acting. So, there comes a time when you need to respond to your friends, and we have this relationship with Canada that involves security, it involves economics, and it's very important to us. And I think that Keystone, truthfully, is a real failing. And I'm not necessarily saying that the president should decide yes or no, but he should decide.
Is it such a big deal that it's put a strain on the relations?
So the answer in my mind is it has, but you also see simultaneously trade growing. So it's a political strain, but it's not necessarily an economic strain. You don't find people coming down from Montreal to shop in Plattsburgh or go on their boats complaining about the Keystone issue. It's largely irrelevant to them. Oops, having trouble with that
That's
word.
Right.
And so it's an issue in Western Canada, I think, more than it is in Eastern Canada. But the feeling is still there. And I think for that reason, we need to be doing things that resolve these issues, or at least finalize them, and then let it take its course.
What do you think might happen if Hillary Clinton were elected on Keystone?
My sense is that she would probably accept it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, clearly that's where the State Department came out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what, year and a half ago? So I think she would accept it. And, the one factor in my mind that is not political that impacts this, of course, is the growth of the United States' ability to produce oil and gas. I think that has also put Obama a little bit back, saying, well, how important is this really? From our perspective, right? From the American perspective. And I think that's weighing as well. I think it's a long-term play myself. I think you need to integrate the U.S. and Canadian oil and gas industries, and I don't mean that in a legal sense, but they need to be integrated so that we can rely on one another in the future.
Some of the tar sands oil, they're going to try to find new ways to get it if they can't send it by the Keystone XL pipeline, and it's not a new way, it's an established way, and that's by rail. And obviously a number of concerns that if the oil, if there are dramatic increases in the amount of oil being shipped by rail from Canada through New York and other states to get to refineries around the East Coast and elsewhere, that there are concerns among a number of environmental groups and others that you're you're dramatically increasing the chances of an accident. And
the same environmental groups that have been ferociously opposed to the Keystone Pipeline that would make unnecessary all of this dangerous passage of oil by train.
And that's true.
Natural gas pipeline in Vermont, for that matter.
That's true.
Yeah, yeah. I guess it's an example of people trying to leverage an issue that they think will give them kind of some political clout. In this case, a pipeline that's being built by a foreign company from a foreign country, so they don't have any popularity in the United States, and they can be tied to an ugly environmental record in Alberta with the tar sands, because tar sands oil is dirtier than most conventional oil. So it looked like a kind of a real winner of a proposition for environmental groups, because they hadn't been able to think through all the implications. If you were to put in place something that actually made sense, like a carbon tax, you would automatically disadvantage tar sands oil and make it harder for the producers to sell it, and less of it would be produced. And you would have a beneficial effect on the whole fossil fuel industry, because fuels like natural gas, which are relatively clean, would be advantaged over fuels like tar sands oil or fracked oil. But it's really hard to do that. There are so many politicians who view a carbon tax as just another tax in the political environment in the United States today. So I'm not saying that the environmental groups that did this did it for bad reasons. Maybe they thought it was their only shot, but it was unfortunate, because when you try to do something indirectly, you can't really predict what the real outcome's going to be.
Now, there's been actually a lot of discussion on carbon tax right from industry folk this last couple of weeks. They are softening up to it, and I was thinking about earlier this week, a carbon tax would most impact the coal industry, and much of our power generation in this country is still in the coal industry. So if you kind of pull the coal off the table because it becomes prohibitively expensive under a carbon tax, it may not be the case that you then outprice oil compared to natural gas. And the carbon footprint for tar sands oil is only about 8% higher than typical extraction methods. So it's not clear, even under a carbon tax, that we would see a shift away from some of these dirtier forms of oil. We'd certainly see a shift away from the dirtiest forms of oil, of power generation through coal.
And I did talk about environmentalists. There are others, obviously, being a county legislator, you know as well, there are non-environmentalists who are concerned that there could be an increase in the amount of traffic. The Bakken crude is being transported now from Canada along Lake Champlain and down to the Port of Albany, and if tar sands followed and the number of trains increased, doubled or tripled, then I think a number of municipalities are worried about that increase in traffic, whether first responders are prepared and such along those
Albany's
lines.
very vulnerable in that respect, is it not? Tremendous amount of traffic through there.
There is. The Port of Albany has sort of become a major hub. And
from 2 or 3 directions for Albany. So
that company based in Massachusetts would like to expand to start taking tar sands oil as well, not just the Bakken crude. And again, I think concerns around New York State, what that would do to the volume of train traffic traveling through small communities and along Lake Champlain and other areas like that.
I think one of the really big issues is the emergency or first responders. In Albany, certainly their risk is increasing, there's no doubt about it. However, they also have availability of resources and access. If you have an accident going from Plattsburgh to Port Henry, you have a real problem. You not only have the potential for great damage to the lake and the environment, but you also have access issues. How do you get a crane there to do the work if you've torn up the track? You're going to put it on a barge and send it up the lake? You may not be able to get access that way. So from my perspective, one of the big issues is how do you find out what the first responders need and is it practical to do? I'm actually giving a speech in Montana in July, and I'm going to reach out to the first responders here to get their perspective to add into my remarks.
And Clinton County has been leading the way in this discussion. Eric Day, our emergency coordinator for Clinton County, is right on top of this, part of the oil train task force that I participate on as well. He's going down to do some training with perhaps some legislators in Albany on Monday over this very issue. So there's an awareness. But I would, to be honest, I would trade tar sands train for a Bakken crude train any day that's far less volatile oil.
I believe it
far
was
less
Bakken
explosive.
crude that caused the really
In Lac
terrible damage in Lac Mégantic. Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
Right. The tar sands would probably be more of an environmental hazard if it got into the lake as far as the cleanup. I think being the heavier crude.
It would dissipate at a much slower rate than the much more volatile crude.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Well, before we go, we talked about this before, and it probably is worth discussing again. The pitch by the mayor of Montreal and many others to bring Major League Baseball back. This started a couple of years ago. Some former players started the drumbeat, and now it seems after 2 springs with some exhibition games, the Blue Jays playing a few games both years, and crowds packing the Big O, about 100,000 both years. Mayor Denis Coderre meeting with Major League Commissioner Rob Manfred down in New York last week, really making a pitch to try to maybe get more games this year and then ultimately get a team back to Montreal.
Making a pitch. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? We went through all this before, and
has it grown? Has the
I'm not
appetite
aware.
or
I'm
the
not aware
demand
of any
grown?
groundswell of support, but it never goes away. There's a certainly support to some extent in the business community, to some extent among politicians, and of course mostly among people who might benefit from a publicly subsidized stadium. But the idea of a province that is relatively poor and more heavily indebted than any other in the country, putting public money into subsidizing millionaire baseball owners and millionaire baseball players, does raise some questions in many minds about whether that's really the smartest use of our money. And my mind is one of those.
This was talked about, has been talked about for a number of years. You've written a number of columns on it. Has there ever been anyone to step forward with really deep pockets to say, we'll buy the team, we'll build the stadium? Or has
No, that's the point. The point is that people are just tremendously eager to talk about how deeply passionate they are about baseball and how they would just love to have a baseball team in Montreal if somebody else will pay for it.
And the commissioner makes no bones about it. Any deal will require a new stadium, that the Big O is not going to be the home, preferably in the downtown somewhere. I don't know if it goes next to the Bell Center, and God forbid I say that, but
that would be some interesting questions about access. Yeah,
but
on the show, huh?
yeah. There was an idea for a stadium that wouldn't have been too far from there. It would because it would have been close to the expressway that carries many people downtown, and that probably would be a good location if it weren't right next to the Bell Center, somewhere in the downtown area, somewhere close to that expressway. But of course, the real question is not where it should be, but who's going to pay for it.
It sounds to me like our friend Jay thinks that the mayor swung and missed.
I hope he missed. He may not have missed. We've had many, many crazier projects like this that wound up being funded by the government of Quebec.
And as we mentioned, the baseball commissioner saying a new stadium would have to go with this. It doesn't seem likely an expansion team would come, so you would probably have to try to lure a team, a major league team, away from their existing home. Perhaps the Tampa Bay Rays seem to be the team that's targeted the most. But again, for most people, there just isn't this overwhelming desire to have a team back.
I think for a significant minority of Montrealers, there is a really passionate love of baseball. I mean, I have friends who certainly feel that way. But it seems to me that if there were a really big market for baseball, if you had the kind of baseball hysteria that you have hockey hysteria in Montreal, then it would be a commercially viable proposition. If it were a commercially viable proposition, you wouldn't be hearing the mayor trying to push it. Somebody would just be doing it.
Jay Bryan, Colin Reed, Bill Owens, always good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.